Hello, everyone, and welcome to Real Talk with Patrick, where I sit with a guest and we have a lovely conversation on whatever subject we so choose to talk about. Today, I have my guest, Jen. Hi, Jen. How are you today?
I'm good. How are you today, Patrick?
I'm doing all right. So, Jen, thank you for coming to the podcast. I know I've had you for the Disney Princess video I had on my YouTube channel, but this is the first time you've actually graced your presence on the podcast. So, how excited are you?
I'm excited. I've never done a podcast before, so you're my
Awesome.
first.
Ooh, good. I love that. So, first things off the bat, how have you been trying to keep yourself busy during these difficult times that we're all kind of facing? That's kind of a question I've been asking my guests. Maybe tips and tricks for fellow listeners.
hmm Well, I'm in one of those fortunate positions where I was able to keep my job and work from home. So I've been working from home this whole pandemic, which has been a bit of a switch, I'll admit. I'm no stranger to working from home one day every so often, but I've never obviously done it on a constant basis like this. Um, So whenever I'm not working, I do spend a lot of time, admittedly, sitting in front of the TV. Uh, Netflix, Prime, Crave, whatever the flavor of the month is, really. And yeah, so I spend a lot of time there. One of my hobbies that I do, though, whenever I'm feeling kind of the pandemic blues, I guess you could call them, is I'm a writer. So I write my own fiction stories, so like science fiction, fantasy type stuff. And that's really what I like to spend most of my time on when I'm not watching TV, which I know is not so healthy, but it's the way I'm getting through.
Hey, at this point, I think we got to do what we've got to do to kind of get ourselves through this difficult times in our life.
hmm
But that's awesome that you're writing. I know because we're friends that you write, so I already know that about you. But that's fantastic. Now, what kind of got you into writing?
Um, well, it's really funny actually, because back when I was in elementary school, I actually went to a French elementary school. So French is my first language. And then I was going into an English high school. So it was kind of a weird transition. But then over that summer, I had this weird dream. And that dream turned into what turned out to be my first story that I really wanted to start writing. And I've always loved storytelling. I grew up reading obviously the Harry Potters, the Tolkiens, all of the wonderful fantasy stories that just make such a magical effect on our world. And I wanted to be one of them. I wanted to tell my stories. Um, so I just started putting down ideas. Most of it handwriting. I would find my favorite colored pens, of course. Back then we used to have gel pens, which were the coolest thing ever. So I got my favorite gel pens and I just started writing, and it was just such a wonderful sensation to see the thoughts in my head getting put onto paper. And it was in no way good. In fact, I'll go back and I'll read what I used to do back in, grade 9. So I was about 13 years old at the time, and it was terrible, but it was something. It was a little small product. And since then, it's been, oh, I'm trying to think now, 16 years since I started writing. And that one tiny little idea that I developed has now turned into a series of 8 books that I'm personally writing for myself and no one else is allowed to read, uh, at least for now. And I actually ended up making it my studies in university because I loved the act of writing so much. I wanted to figure out how to do it better. So after I had my first anxiety attack in high school, where at first I was going in the direction of being an astrophysicist of all things. But then I failed a math test and I had my panic attack. And my mom came and she calmed me down. And she's like, "What do you love doing more than anything else in the world?" And I said, "Writing." It was the first answer that came to my lips. So from there, I was hooked. I just write all the time now. I just came downstairs and my husband's been sleeping all morning because we had a long night building puzzles, funny enough. Um, and I just finished writing 4,000 words of my story. Yeah. So that's it, it's just such a it's a wondrous feeling to be able to immerse yourself into your own world. Um, yeah.
I mean, that's amazing. I mean, so it's kind of funny because when you were telling your story about how you kind of got into it, it actually reminded me of how I got into writing because um, I've done some writing. I haven't done a lot of writing recently, like recently, a couple of years now. But it was funny. I went to an all French school until about grade six. Then we moved and I went to a French immersion school. But in high school, it was an English high school with French classes.
Hmm.
But we had an MSIP period, which is, for some people that might not know what that is, it's basically how the curriculum worked at the time was I think it was an hour and 15 minutes for each class, but they took the 15 minutes off of the classes to make another period, which was like the homework period. So you could do your homework and stuff for the other classes you had. So when I started in grade nine, a lot of the classes I had either weren't giving a lot of homework or I would get them done super quickly. So I had a lot of time because it's an hour class and you're just sitting there. So I actually started writing in grade nine during my MSIT period. And because I really didn't have a lot of friends at the time either. So it was like, let's just get into writing. And I would do a lot of horror writing. And basically, I would just kind of like rewrite or retell the stories of like some horror movies I watched and like just kind of do it. And then I did one where it was like all my friends from high school were in like this horror story of mine. And like, so I've done a lot of things like that. And then I kind of, like you said, looking back, they're not good. They're really not good. The spelling mistakes, I'm not using the proper there or there, but it was one of those outlets, just get it on paper. And it was great. It passed the time. It was fun. I enjoyed it. But I'm really happy that you've kind of taken that passion and keep it up because that's fantastic. I think
Hmm.
that's so important to find something you really enjoy and keep it going. Now, you said that it's for your eyes only, and that's fine, but could you just give us a little bit of a hint of what it's kind of like? Like, is it like a Lord of the Rings? Is it like a Star Wars? Just a little taste.
I would never be able to compare myself to Lord of the Rings because Tolkien was such an incredible writer and so detailed, and he was so good at showing a reader what his environment was like. I'm actually still working on that. I'm more of a teller. I like to tell people what I'm doing, so I essentially write my books like a movie. Um, but yeah, I hate explaining my story. I always feel so self-conscious.
You
But
don't have
essentially,
to.
I know, but I will. I'll try. It's gonna sound weird and a little bit cobbled together, but I'll give it a shot. It's about these kids who are in high school, so teenagers, um, and they get wound up into this world, like worlds of conflict among an alliance of planets. And it's a story of magic, it's a story of friendship and of love, and um, it just, I don't know, it's about just reaching for that thing that you don't know that you can do. It's hard to explain, but yeah, it's a magic story. But it also has elements of science to it because my core is grounded in science, in possibility. So it's kind of magic explained in a way. There's always a little bit of an inexplicable element to magic, obviously, but I like to think of it as a tangible thing.
I love that. That honestly sounds amazing. The way you're explaining it, I'm like, ah, this is amazing. That sounds like such a good series. But that's great. That's awesome. And I'm super proud of you, obviously, for doing this because I just love that you're, again, I'm repeating myself, going with the passion of what you enjoy to do. Now, a lot of it is obviously fiction. You're writing a series. Now, have you ever considered going into like other genres of
Yeah,
novelization?
I have. I used to do creative writing classes both in high school and university, so I've done all sorts of fun little pieces. I did a short story for my creative writing class in university that was about essentially mutants. So mutants in the not too distant future, not quite X-Men, but the same. It's almost I describe it as a darker side of X-Men, almost like X-Men meets Watchmen. And I just did like a 3-page short story, but it was a world that I fell in love with. So I actually have little ideas on a little piece of paper about other short stories in this world that could work well. I've also dabbled in kind of war stories, which was a little bit weird for me. I do tend to stick more to the fantasy and science fiction stuff. But I've played around with other types. I can't say I've ever done horror though, Patrick. That's very much your genre.
Yes, it's very much my genre, my niche. I mean, yeah, I think I'll go into one of my stories. The one where I kind of wrote with like my high school friend about my high school friends was it was similar to like I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Prom Night.
Can't
So
say I have.
so I've never seen the original with Jamie Lee Curtis, but the remake, I've seen the remake with I think it was I forget her name. Anyway, something Snow. Uh Brittany Snow or something. I can't remember. Anywho, and the premise of that story though is she was like I think it was a former teacher or former guy, I can't remember, like tried to attack her and became obsessed with her. So he was like
Mm.
locked up in an insane asylum. Your classic. And now it's like, ooh, prom night. She's gonna go with her friends, but oh my gosh, he's escaped. And they're trying to like be okay about it, but he shows up and he starts killing her friends one by one. So like your classic slasher story. But anyway, so I was telling that story similar to that story, but we didn't know who the killer was at all. And it was just we were all going to like this prom event, but then yeah, my friends started getting killed off one by one.
Oh,
And like some of my friends at the time would like go out back and like smoke or like party and stuff like that. So when they go off to like smoke, that's when they die or stuff like that. And I think in the end, um, no one knew who the killer was, but I tell the readers who the killer is.
oh,
And or we think it's someone, but it actually ends up being someone else. And it was one of those classic twists. And then I ended up coming out with a sequel for the survivors and they're getting targeted now.
oh,
Um
that's brutal.
yeah, it
Because
was terrible.
you think that these poor people have been through the worst horror of their lives, and now you're just pitching them into another one. Come on, Patrick.
I mean, it's classic horror and you've got to do it. Just when you think everything's fine, no, the person's back again for a vengeance. Because a lot of the times, what do you think? What? It's a happy ending, the killer's locked up, it's the end of the story. No, that killer's angry and he's going to find a way to get out. He or she, whoever, tries to get out and tries to hunt down the ones that
Yeah.
got away. So that's my genre of writing. I had also been interested in maybe writing. I know it's kind of not vain of me because, but I'm like an autobiography
Oh, that would be amazing.
because I have always thought that would be interesting to write. But I mean, it's one of those things where it's like, what can you write about? I know I can write stuff, but I don't know what I could write. Like, would it be just about my life? Obviously, but then I'm like in my late 20s. So that's
Mm.
not like so people, oh, he hasn't lived a full life. Like what is he can talk about and give us advice and whatever. So, we'll see. but you never know. Someday. Now,
Yeah.
a question for you. Have you ever considered potentially publishing a book of yours?
I've thought about it. Obviously, it's intimidating because, as I said, like I write these because it helps me deal with my anxiety. It helps me get through the pandemic. It's a very personal experience for me right now to write. Obviously, the dream is to publish my stories, to have everyone love them and live off of those proceedings. It'd be really nice to be able to write for a living. I know that there are very few people who get that kind of privilege. It would be fun. I think at some point, maybe when I feel like my storytelling is up to a point where it's, worthy of being put onto actual physical pages, then maybe I'll consider it.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm always there for the minute you decide to publish, self publish, whatever. I'll be picking up that book right away and I'll be reading it. So that's good for you. Now, you mentioned your husband.
Mm.
So, how has he been supportive wise? I know he's a great supporter of you writing. So, how has that been like? And what does he do to like help you out with that, we'll say?
Well, he he obviously he gives me time to myself, especially right now where both of us are kind of stuck in the house. So he's very good about, anytime I'm like, you know what, I'm in a writing mood. I've got my mojo on right now. He's like, okay. He goes away, he plays on his phone, he builds a New York City 3D puzzle, whatever he chooses to, whatever the flavor of the day is. But then I bounce ideas off of him too, because he's one of the few who's actually been able to read a little bit, not all of it, of the story. So I'm able to bounce ideas off of him and say, hey, what do you think about this? And I'm kind of torn between these two ideas of where I think the story should go. And he's there to help me kind of flesh them out and be able to say, okay, you know what, this one is really in keeping with the characters, this one not so much. Or if you take it in this direction, maybe there's, an opportunity to do this other thing that you mentioned the other day. He's a listener. He's so attentive, and he just he supports me. He knows that if I ever do, for instance, decide to publish, he'll be right beside me the whole time, and it's a wonderful relationship that we have.
That's amazing. And I'm so glad that you have someone to bounce ideas off of because I know myself when I've written, like I was writing this story and it centered more around a house. Now that is hard. And writing's hard. It's not easy because it either comes to you sometimes or you have to sit and think and you get writer's block. It happens. But for me with this house, the thing is when I'm writing the story, I have to remember the layout of the house because it's so heavily based on the inside of a house. I'm like, okay, so the kitchen has to be here, and then the living room has to be here, but then the bedrooms are up there, but then which bedrooms where? And like, because it has to make sense. Because then, oh, if this person's looking out the window, well, and if they're seeing the front of the house or outside the front, then it's like, okay, but then if I reference the person's looking out a window now and now it's the back, it's like, well, how does that make sense with the house? The
Hmm.
continuity of it all can be
It
sometimes
can,
difficult.
yeah. And what I love to do with things like that, and I know you love Sims, Patrick, so you might actually be able to take this one on, is I like to build it. So I work with cities, I work with worlds, I work with continents in my massive world that I've built. And so I've drawn maps, very Tolkien style again. But for yours, where the house is your absolute core location, I suggest build it on Sims, put it together there. And that way you're able to say, okay, so if they're here, oh, no, you know what? They're not looking out the back window. They're looking out at the front street. And it's fun to be able to put your ideas into something more visual. It depends on how you learn and how you can function too, because I know a lot of people are very hands-on or very visual learners. So that's helped me personally. So.
That's actually a really good idea. I don't know why. I never thought of that. I never thought of just just do it in The Sims.
Just do it in
And
Sims.
that makes sense. That makes total sense now. Oh my goodness. You've re-inspired me to take up the story again that I haven't written in like years now. That's been like in the back of my mind.
And you don't have to do it all at once. So that's one of the things that I did for myself. It was actually back in university. After my first year, I hadn't written a word. I'd kind of just paused. I'd writer's block. I just hadn't written anything. And it was a New Year's resolution because I realized, you know what? I want to keep writing. It does bring me joy. It's something that I want to keep in my life. And so I said, okay, 250 words a day. That's all. Like if I write more, fantastic. But I have to write a minimum of 250 words a day. If I don't write 250 words that day, I have to write 1,000 the next day. It's a way to punish myself into actually writing. And it didn't matter if it was good. It didn't matter if it was part of one of the stories that I was writing. It doesn't it doesn't matter. You can go and describe 250 words of the forest behind my house as long as you write. It's getting you into that head. And there are days during this pandemic where I've felt so drained. And I'm like, oh, I really don't want to do my 250 words. But I know that if I don't do my 250 words today, I have to do my 1,000 words tomorrow. So I'm like, okay, fine. So then I go and I write, and a couple of nights in the past month, it's been sitting in bed and I start my 250 and I just keep going. And an hour later, I've written several thousand words. Sometimes it's just that's all it takes to get you into the mojo. So yeah, that's one thing that I suggest. 250 words isn't much. It's half a page. And it just helps get the juices flowing and get the habit going.
That's actually a really good idea and suggestion because I'll always remember when I first started my YouTube channel, the words you said to me were kind of, you're doing this for yourself, you're doing this for fun. It doesn't matter how much you produce, just as long as you're enjoying yourself.
Exactly.
And I still to this day keep that in my mind, honestly, those words. And I'm like, okay, I'm doing this because I like doing it. I want to do this. It's has nothing to do with anything else. It's just I like doing it. Who cares? And I mean, as you're aware, I did take a little break, but and I was nervous to do that
Mm,
because it's scary taking a little break, especially when it's like a public facing platform and stuff.
yes.
But I remember those words that you said, and I'm like, no, you know what? I am allowed to do this. I'm doing this for myself. I enjoy doing this. If I want to do it again, I'll come back when I'm ready.
Exactly.
So I've always appreciated that and taken that to heart and things like that. Now, one final question that I'd like to ask you is it'll just be a random question off the top of my head. Which fictional character from a book that you've read in the past would you want to be?
Oh, you know what? I have to go back. And I know there's a lot of controversy around J.K. Rowling and the Harry Potter books, especially in light of her um, views
Mhm.
on trans and transgender, which I completely disagree with her views, by the way. But I love the stories she produces, and Hermione Granger has forever spoken to me. And I would love to be Hermione Granger in Hogwarts, learning, to use magic and running around with the big troublemakers of the school. So Hermione Granger would have to be my answer there.
I'll be honest, actually, I had a feeling that's who you were gonna say. And I'm like, feel like you're gonna say Hermione. Or since I wasn't as familiar with the Harry Potter stories because I didn't read them growing up, I always saw that name as Hermione. But, and then I'm like,
Uh,
oh, it's Hermione.
Oh no, it took me when the movies first came out, I'm like, who's Hermione? Like Hermione is the name I know her by. So yeah, no, I'm with you.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, that's great. As for me, I'm trying to think
Mm.
because when I ask the question, I usually like to answer it too. Oh dear. You know what? Honestly, for me, probably Nancy Drew
Oh, I
because
could see that.
because
Yes.
I actually grew up reading Nancy Drew and I remember back in school in elementary school because I my aunt used to own like a small older collection of them from when she was young. And she let me read some of them. So I would read those books. And then I would, at the library in elementary school, try and like sneakily check them out without getting teased and stuff because, you know, what's a boy reading about a girl detective? Oh my gosh, what a loser. Uh, Gender stereotypes and norms. But anyways, we won't go there right now. But
No.
Nancy Drew, I own a lot of Nancy Drew books. I love Nancy Drew. I mean, sure, looking back at it now and reading the stories now a little bit, they're a little cliche, or you know, she's usually wearing sundress or whatever, and like kind of dainty but not dainty. But I always thought that, you know what, she was a very strong, powerful woman, and I would always choose Nancy Drew books over the Hardy Boys. Never read a Hardy Boy book because the Hardy Boys were not for me. It was Nancy Drew all the way. Loved it, and I got so immersed in it that, like, because she has two friends in her story, Bess and George, two
Mhm.
girls that are friends of hers. And when I'd read it and she'd go travel somewhere to solve a mystery, I'd be like, oh, Bess and George are going. I'd be relieved. And I'd be like, oh, good, she's going with other people. She's not going alone. Thank goodness. Because I was worried for Nancy Drew, the fictional character of the story. And I think they still come out with books about Nancy Drew, but I think it's that original collection, like the one like that started with The Secret in the Old Clock. I think is the first
Mhm.
ever one, and I love those stories. So for me, it'd be Nancy Drew.
Very nice.
Yes, girl detective.
Yes.
Anyways, so thank you so much for joining me for this lovely podcast. Did you have a
Oh,
good time?
I had a fantastic time, as usual, talking to you, Patrick.
Well, shucks. But anyways, thank you to all our lovely listeners. You can check out my podcast wherever podcasts can be found: Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcast, or any other platform. Also, if you have any questions, any suggestions on other guests you'd like, always email me at realtalkwithpatrick@gmail.com. Again, that's realtalkwithpatrick@gmail.com. And until next time, I hope you guys have a lovely day. Bye.